Today marks the 10th anniversary of the pro-democracy movement in Yemen. But a decade later, very little has improved there. Millions of civilians are currently at risk of starvation. The UN has called Yemen the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, with 80% of its people in need. Well, to talk a bit more about the situation in Yemen with me now, I'm joined by Elisabeth, who is a senior research fellow in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, let's go back in time. What triggered the uprising 10 years ago?
It's tempting to see the uprising in Yemen simply as part of a domino effect after Tunisia and then simultaneously with Egypt. But in fact, it had been building for years. Yemenis were fed up of over 3 decades of rule by the same man, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and that had already led to lots of protests over poor governance, over marginalization, over corruption. But yes, there were some immediate triggers. Of course, there was the encouragement of seeing uprisings in other Arab countries, and there was also an immediate plan for that president to put his son into power. So that tipped it over the edge. And then on this day, 10 years ago, thousands of Yemenis came out onto the streets of Sana'a to protest.
How did the government respond to that?
The government responded with repression, as it often did. And that really was what drove the uprisings forward. It gave them extra energy. One particular incident was in March, so a couple of months down the line, when the government government loyal forces fired on protesters, and they killed dozens of them. And that led to a lot of defections from the president's camp. And from that point onwards, really, he was on his way out. And there was a GCC initiative, a Gulf Cooperation Council initiative, that same year. But it didn't really work. There was no transitional justice. It was simply the case that the former president's deputy took over from him. There was only a one-man race in the election. So it didn't really solve the problem, and protesters' demands weren't met.
You mentioned that GCC initiative, which was led by the UN and originally held up as a model around the world. Yet today, Yemen is at war. Why did the transition fail?
Yes, good question. Why did it fail? Well, after that GCC initiative in 2011, there was, as you say, a United Nations-led national dialogue. And that ran from 2013 to 14. But it never addressed the really big issues. How was Yemen going to be split up? How were the territory, resources, and power going to be shared? And so really it was just inevitable that the warring sides, that the different groups, the different factions, all wanting their own pieces of Yemen, would come to loggerheads because they weren't being listened to, and the really big issues just hadn't been addressed. So by 2015, we ended up in a situation where the different warring sides were actually in open conflict, and that caused the Saudi-led coalition to have to enter on the side of the government. And we've been there ever since. We're now almost 6 years into a war.
6 years into a war, of course, which has devastating humanitarian crisis, as well as I was mentioning earlier. Is there any hope for peace at this point?
I wish there were, and we have had some glimmers of hope. There was very recently a new unity government announced, which at least mended some of the rifts in the government coalition between the southern separatists and the government of President Hadi. So they could present a more united front in their battle against the northern rebels, the Houthis. But it's a very fragile alliance. And there have been some prisoner swaps, which show confidence-building measures on both sides. But I don't think peace is on the cards anytime soon. Agreements have failed to be implemented properly on the ground. The talks are not inclusive enough. And ceasefires perennially fail. Ultimately, I think the conflict is at risk still of fragmenting further.
But given that, and just one last word, Elisabeth, before you go, what more should the international community be doing? What more could it be doing?
Well, the international community talks a lot about funding for aid. And of course, that's really important. But it means that one's taking one's eye off the ball of the underlying drivers of conflict. Ultimately, we have to put more pressure on our regional allies to make the hard compromises necessary to bring about peace. And also, actually, to engage Iran. Iran's influence in this conflict has been growing. It wasn't really that obvious at the start, but it has been growing throughout the conflict, and ultimately it will need to be engaged as part of a peace effort. So I think most observers now recognize that you cannot bomb your way out of this war. Ultimately, it will have to be a diplomatic solution, and that needs to involve regional players, not just domestic ones at this point.
Elisabeth, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us here on France 24. Elisabeth Kendall there from the University of Oxford, talking about the ongoing devastation and the horrible situation at the moment in Yemen.